The date is August 23rd, 2004. On the outskirts of Ciudad Juárez, an unforgiving desert, a landscape of scorched ochre that blends into the dusty sky holds the border's darkest secrets. The sun beats down without mercy, creating mirages on the cracked asphalt. Federal agents, their faces covered to shield them from the dust and the stench already beginning to rise from the earth, are following an anonymous tip. A distorted voice on the phone that spoke of a private graveyard. They've arrived at the backyard of a modest cinder block house in the Las Acequias neighborhood. A humble community where life hangs by a thread, balanced between scarcity and the dream of crossing to the other side. The air is thick, heavy not just with the suffocating heat, but with the sweet cloying stench of death and the premonition of an unimaginable horror. Neighbors watch from behind their curtains, a mixture of curiosity and fear. They know that in Juárez, it's best to see nothing, hear nothing, and say nothing. Soon, the agent's shovels strike something other than dirt and rock. It's not the dull thud of stone, but a hollow, soft sound. They unearth a body wrapped in a tarp, then another bound with barbed wire, and then another. The scene becomes a macabre ritual under the unforgiving sun. By the end of the day, as the sky is stained a blood orange, the count rises to 12 victims, buried in a clandestine grave. Many show signs of brutal torture: burns, amputated fingers, shattered skulls. The property, until then anonymous, would forever be known as the House of Death, the first of several that would reveal a machinery of extermination operating in plain sight. A human slaughterhouse in service of a cartel. This discovery wasn't the beginning of the violence, but the belated revelation of an empire built in the shadows, a kingdom ruled by a ghost. A man who, unlike his ostentatious, fame-hungry contemporaries, avoided cameras and headlines with iron discipline. His power wasn't measured in shootouts, but in the silence of the plains that streaked across the night sky. His influence was so vast, it was said he controlled the skies of an entire continent. His name, Amado Carrillo Fuentes, better known as El Senor de los Cielos, the Lord of the Skies. But who really was this man, hiding behind a veil of mystery and a fleet of commercial jets? Was he merely a ruthless drug lord who perfected the logistics of evil, a sociopath with an innate talent for distribution? Or was he a visionary business strategist, a criminal mastermind who, from the shadows, built a conglomerate so sophisticated it challenged the sovereignty of entire nations, putting both the DEA and the Mexican government itself in check? Join me as we delve into the origins of the Juárez Cartel and the man who, with his silence and his audacity, turned a border city into the epicenter of global drug trafficking, and, ultimately, a hell on earth. The story of the Juárez Cartel, and by extension that of Amado Carrillo Fuentes, cannot be understood without first looking south to the cradle of modern drug trafficking in Mexico, the Golden Triangle. This region, an impassable knot of remote mountains and valleys, spanning the states of Sinaloa, Chihuahua, and Durango, has for generations been a lawless land, a perfect refuge for outlaws and smugglers. Its rugged geography makes it nearly impenetrable for the state, but ideal for cultivating opium poppies and marijuana. It was here, in this crucible of extreme poverty, state neglect, and a deep-rooted culture of defiance against authority, where the first legends of the underworld were born. In the 1970s, the business was dominated by small family clans, ranchers who competed and collaborated in a precarious balance. But one man with a corporate vision would change the game forever. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, a former Sinaloan judicial police officer, a man with a smooth demeanor and a calculating mind, understood that the fragmentation of the business was a weakness. With remarkable political cunning, he united the top traffickers of the era, including legendary figures like Rafael Caro Quintero, the charismatic and flamboyant narco of narcos, and Ernesto Don Neto Fonseca Carrillo, an old-school capo, to form Mexico's first super cartel, the Guadalajara Cartel. This organization wasn't just a gang, it was a federation, a conglomerate that controlled nearly all drug production and trafficking into the United States, functioning like a board of directors for crime. It was inside this university of crime, under the tutelage of the greats, that a young nephew of Don Neto, Amado Carrillo Fuentes, would begin his apprenticeship. Born in Guamuchilito, Sinaloa, into a family of 14 children, Amado possessed neither the flamboyance of Caro Quintero nor the impulsive brutality of other capos. He was quiet, observant, and methodical. While others got drunk on power, building gaudy mansions and surrounding themselves with beauty queens, Amado studied the least glamorous but most crucial part of the business: logistics. He learned about air and land routes, about how to corrupt a federal police commander or a customs inspector, about the most efficient methods of transportation, and above all, about the vital importance of discretion. His uncle, Don Neto, saw in him a cold intelligence and a talent for organization, and he put him in charge of overseeing cocaine shipments in Chihuahua. This gave him first-hand knowledge of the Juárez Plaza, a strategic corridor that, due to its geography and direct connection to the U.S. highway system, would become the crown jewel of the drug trade. It was during these formative years that Amado conceived the idea that would define him. He saw that the traditional methods of smuggling, drug mules, cars with hidden compartments, small Cessna planes that could barely carry a few hundred kilos, were inefficient, risky, and limited the business's growth. His vision was far more ambitious: to use large commercial airliners, like Boeing 727s, to transport tons of cocaine in a single trip, turning drug trafficking into an industrial-scale air cargo operation. This idea, which seemed like a fantasy to his contemporaries, would become the foundation of his future empire and earn him the nickname that would immortalize him: the Lord of the Skies. The Guadalajara Cartel's empire, which seemed invincible, collapsed because of a single act of supreme arrogance. In 1985, Enrique Kiki Camarena, a DEA undercover agent who had managed to infiltrate the organization at its highest levels, was kidnapped in broad daylight in Guadalajara. He was brutally tortured for over 30 hours and finally murdered. The brutality of the crime was a direct affront, a declaration of war on the United States, which unleashed an unprecedented manhunt. Operation Leyenda was Washington's furious response, a campaign of diplomatic and operational pressure that forced the hitherto complacent Mexican government to act. The border was virtually shut down, tourism plummeted, and DEA agents flooded the country. One by one, the cartel's leaders fell. Rafael Caro Quintero and Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo were captured, and finally, in 1989, Felix Gallardo himself, the boss of bosses, was arrested from the maximum security prison of Almoloya. In a last-ditch effort to maintain control and prevent a bloody war over his spoils, Felix Gallardo convened a summit in Acapulco. There, through his lawyers, he divided his federation into territories, or plazas, assigning his lieutenants control over the different smuggling routes. The violent and ambitious Arellano Felix brothers got the Tijuana Plaza. The faction of Hector El Güero Palma and a young Joaquin El Chapo Guzman got the Sinaloa Corridor. And the most lucrative plaza of all, the Ciudad Juárez Corridor, was inherited by Rafael Aguilar Guajardo, with Amado Carrillo Fuentes as his discreet but indispensable second-in-command. This event, known as the balkanization of the Mexican drug trade, marked the end of one era and the beginning of a new, far more violent one. The peace imposed by the Guadalajara Federation was shattered, and the new cartels, now rivals, began to compete fiercely for control of routes and markets. For Amado, this fragmentation was the opportunity he had been patiently awaiting. Aguilar Guajardo, his boss, was assassinated in 1993 while vacationing in Cancun, gunned down in a spectacular attack that many attribute to Amado himself, who wasted no time in assuming total control of the Juárez Cartel. With power in his hands, he could finally set in motion the vision he had cultivated for years. While the other cartels bled each other dry in turf wars that filled the headlines, Amado focused on efficiency and expansion. He did what no one had done before. Through shell companies and contacts in civil aviation, he bought a fleet of Boeing 727 passenger jets, ripped out the seats, and used them to fly cocaine from the Colombian cartels directly from South America to clandestine airstrips in the Chihuahuan Desert. The drugs arrived in industrial quantities, often up to 15 tons per flight. From there, the shipments were stored in secure warehouses in Juárez and then crossed into El Paso, Texas, in semi-trucks or through a sophisticated network of tunnels. His system was so efficient and discreet that he became the preferred partner of the Colombian cartels, especially the Cali cartel, who paid him not in cash but with a percentage of each shipment, often up to 50%. Amado wasn't just a transporter. He had become the world's largest cocaine distributor. His empire wasn't built on flashy violence, but on quiet, systemic corruption. He understood that true strength lay not in hitmen, but in the control of institutions. His payroll included federal police commanders, army generals, high-level politicians, and customs officials on both sides of the border. His influence reached such a surreal point that in 1997, General Jesus Gutierrez Rebollo, the man appointed by Mexico's president to be the country's drug czar, was arrested and exposed as one of Amado's chief protectors. The Lord of the Skies didn't need to wage a war against the state. He had simply bought it. He moved like a phantom, rarely seen in public, his face almost unknown to the public and the authorities. While El Chapo Guzman and the Arellano Felix brothers cultivated legends of audacity and brutality, Amado Carrillo Fuentes was building a corporate empire in the shadows, amassing a fortune estimated at over $25 billion, making him one of the richest and most powerful men on the planet. His silent reign brought Juárez an era of apparent calm, a pax narca, where violence was surgical and targeted, not the indiscriminate chaos that would come later. But beneath that surface of tranquility, the roots of a future hell were sinking deep into the desert soil. The rise of Amado Carrillo Fuentes in the mid-1990s represented a fundamental transformation in the world of organized crime. His Juárez cartel operated less like a gang of thugs and more like a multinational logistics corporation, a kind of FedEx for the drug trade. The key innovation, his fleet of the skies, wasn't just a technical advance, but a paradigm shift. Before him, smuggling was a game of small margins and high risk, limited by the cargo capacity of land vehicles or small planes. Amado turned it into a large-scale foreign trade operation. The planes, often bought from bankrupt airlines in South America and registered with shell companies in tax havens, would land on remote ranches and makeshift airstrips that stretched across northern Mexico, sometimes on stretches of federal highway that were momentarily closed by corrupt police. The logistics on the ground were equally impressive. Once the cocaine arrived, it was guarded by convoys of heavily armed men and transported to a network of warehouses and safe houses in and around Juárez. The border city became the world's largest warehouse for a single illicit product. Amado's power lay not in a monopoly on production, but in near absolute control of transportation. He positioned himself as the indispensable middleman between the Colombian producers of the Cali cartel and the distributors in major U.S. cities. He understood that the real value wasn't in the coca leaf, but in the ability to move the final product across heavily guarded borders with minimal risk. This position allowed him to create a kind of de facto federation, an uneasy alliance with other traffickers. Instead of constant turf wars, Amado often preferred negotiation, charging a piso or tax to other groups, including El Chapo's burgeoning cartel, for using his routes. He owned the air bridge, and everyone had to pay the toll. This business-like approach, though backed by the threat of lethal implicit violence, brought relative stability to the Mexican underworld. A tense calm that stood in stark contrast to the open warfare that would erupt after his death. The other pillar of his empire was a corruption so deep and systematic that it practically merged the cartel with the state. Amado didn't just bribe individuals, he corrupted entire institutions. His influence extended from patrol officers on the streets of Juárez to the highest levels of government in Mexico City. The case of General Gutierrez Rebollo was just the tip of the iceberg. It was discovered that the drug czar was living in a luxury apartment owned by Amado and receiving millions of dollars in exchange for classified information on military operations, protection for shipments, and the elimination of the Juárez cartel's rivals. This level of infiltration meant the organization operated with a degree of near-total impunity. They knew when and where raids would happen, which routes were being watched, and which officials were reliable. Amado's organization also included a counterintelligence arm that spied on law enforcement agencies, both Mexican and American, using sophisticated surveillance technology, and a network of informants that reached into the DEA's offices in El Paso. This control allowed him to remain in the shadows, a specter whose existence was more rumor than proven fact to the general public. While other capos appeared in party videos or on society pages, Amado cultivated an aura of invisibility. It's said he rarely slept in the same place 2 nights in a row and used a retinue of body doubles to confuse his enemies and the authorities. This obsession with anonymity was his greatest strength and, paradoxically, what would lead to his downfall. Despite his discretion, the sheer scale of his operation finally drew the full attention of the DEA and other international agencies. By late 1996, the United States had identified him as the most powerful and dangerous drug trafficker in the world, surpassing even the Colombian capos. The pressure on the Mexican government to capture him became immense. With the fall of his protector, General Gutierrez Rebollo, Amado felt the net tightening. He knew that his face, though little known, was now the #1 target in the war on drugs. Trapped by his own success, the Invisible Man realized he needed to truly disappear. This desperate need led him to a fatal decision, an attempt to cheat fate that would end in an operating room in Mexico City, writing the final, most enigmatic chapter of his life. The pressure on Amado Carrillo Fuentes in early 1997 was suffocating. The U.S. government, embarrassed by the Gutierrez Rebollo scandal and frustrated by the ineffectiveness of its Mexican counterparts, had intensified its intelligence operations and was offering a multi-million-dollar reward for his capture. The Lord of the Skies, who had thrived on anonymity, suddenly found himself the most wanted man in the hemisphere. His movements were restricted, his communications were monitored, and his closest associates were starting to be captured or killed. He knew his time was running out. The only way out he saw was a clean slate. A transformation so complete it would allow him to vanish forever. It was then that he conceived a plan as audacious as it was desperate: to change his face. Through his contacts, he arranged for a complex plastic surgery to alter his features and liposuction to change his physical build. The procedure would be carried out in absolute secrecy at the Santa Monica Hospital in Mexico City. On July 3, 1997, Amado Carrillo Fuentes checked into the hospital under a pseudonym. The medical team, led by renowned surgeons, began the operation, which would last over 8 hours. However, something went terribly, fatally wrong. During the procedure, or in the hours immediately following, Amado died. The official cause of death was an adverse reaction to an anesthetic drug which, combined with his undiagnosed heart condition, caused him to go into respiratory arrest. He was 40 years old. The news of his death was met with skepticism and shock. How could the world's most powerful drug trafficker, a man who had eluded armies and intelligence agencies, die in such a mundane way? Conspiracy theories bloomed immediately. Some believed he had faked his death to escape, leaving a decoy body. Others whispered that he had been murdered on the operating table by his rivals, or even by his own men, eager to seize control of the empire. The legend of the Lord of the Skies was so great that his end seemed implausible. The Mexican government, in an attempt to quash the doubts, presented the body to the media. The face was swollen and bruised from the surgery, almost unrecognizable. Only after fingerprint and DNA tests confirmed his identity did the world begin to accept that the ghost had been vanquished, not by a bullet or a jail cell, but by his own vanity and desperation. The mystery deepened months later when the bodies of the 3 surgeons who had performed the operation were found inside metal barrels, sealed with cement, and abandoned on the side of the Mexico-Acapulco highway. They showed signs of extreme torture. It was never definitively known who murdered them. Was it the cartel punishing them for their failure? Or was it a cleanup of loose ends, silencing the only witnesses to what really happened in that operating room? Amado's death left a colossal power vacuum. His brother, Vicente Carrillo Fuentes, known as El Viceroy, assumed leadership of the cartel. Vicente was a feared man, but he lacked Amado's business acumen and diplomatic skill. The Juárez Cartel, which under Amado had been a relatively stable federation held together by deals and bribes, began to fracture. The viceroy tried to rule with an iron fist, but the loyalty his brother had bought quickly evaporated. Other cartels, particularly the Sinaloa cartel led by an ambitious Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, saw an opportunity to seize the crown jewel, the Juárez Plaza. The Pax Narca was over. What followed was one of the bloodiest wars in the history of organized crime. El Chapo, who had been a junior partner in Amado's federation, refused to keep paying the piso for using the Juárez corridor. In 2004, he ordered the assassination of El Viceroy's younger brother, Rodolfo Carrillo Fuentes, outside a movie theater in Culiacán. Vicente's response was brutal and personal. He ordered the murder of El Chapo's brother, Arturo El Pollo Guzman, while he was inside the La Palma prison. These two deaths shattered any code of honor that remained between them and marked the beginning of an all-out war for Juárez. The city that had been the quiet operations hub of an empire was about to become a battlefield, where the sound of gunfire would drown out any memory of peace. The Lord of the Skies was dead, and the demons his empire had kept at bay were now free to unleash hell. Behind every shadow empire, there is an even bloodier fall. The story that power wanted to bury is just beginning. If you dare to learn it, you know where to find it. Subscribe, because what's coming is even darker. The war between the Juárez Cartel, now under the command of Vicente Carrillo Fuentes, and the Sinaloa Cartel, led by Joaquín El Chapo Guzman, transformed Ciudad Juárez from a drug logistics hub into the murder capital of the world. The violence that erupted from 2007 onward was unprecedented in its scale and brutality. It was no longer about selective assassinations of rivals. It became a campaign of indiscriminate terror designed to subjugate the population and destroy the enemy's morale. The Juárez Cartel relied on its armed wing, La Línea, a death squad largely composed of corrupt current and former police officers who acted with military precision and ruthless cruelty. For its part, the Sinaloa Cartel deployed its own shock troops, Gente Nueva, recruited from young sicarios and military deserters. The city was carved into invisible territories, and crossing the wrong street could be a death sentence. The tactics employed by both sides took the war to a new level of barbarism. Car bombs, a tactic rarely seen in Mexico, became a tool of terror. In July 2010, a car bomb detonated by La Línea in downtown Juárez killed a paramedic, a doctor, and a federal police officer, marking a chilling escalation. Decapitations and dismemberment became commonplace, with human remains left in public places alongside narcomantas, messages written on banners containing threats to rivals or officials. The goal was not just to kill, but to terrorize. Kidnappings and extortion skyrocketed, affecting business owners, merchants, and ordinary citizens. The city's economy was paralyzed. Thousands of businesses closed, and those who could afford it fled to El Paso, Texas, creating a generation of economic and social exiles. Daily life became a nightmare. Shootouts in restaurants, shopping malls, and at parties became routine. One of the most tragic events occurred in January 2010, when a commando team stormed a high school birthday party in the Villa de Salvarcar neighborhood and massacred 15 young people, mistaking them for members of a rival gang. This event shocked Mexico and the world, exposing the absolute vulnerability of civilians caught in the crossfire. In response, the Mexican government under President Felipe Calderón launched Operation Chihuahua in 2008, deploying thousands of soldiers and federal police. However, their arrival, far from pacifying the city, exacerbated the violence. Allegations of human rights abuses, arbitrary detentions, torture, and extrajudicial killings by the military multiplied. The people of Juárez found themselves trapped between two fires: the brutality of the cartels and the repression of a state that often failed to distinguish between criminals and civilians. The statistics of the war are staggering. In 2007, Juárez recorded just over 300 homicides. By 2010, the bloodiest year, that number skyrocketed to over 3,100, giving the city a homicide rate of roughly 270 per 100,000 residents. the highest in the world for a city of its size. Between 2008 and 2012, more than 10,000 people were murdered in Juárez. The war also had a devastating impact on the social fabric. The disappearance of hundreds of women, a phenomenon known as the dead women of Juárez, dating back to the 1990s, intensified. Many of these women, young factory workers, fell victim to gender-based violence exacerbated by the climate of impunity and total chaos. The war for Juárez was a war of attrition. Slowly, the Sinaloa cartel, with its vast resources and strategic alliances, began to gain ground. By 2012, the violence started to decrease, not because peace had arrived, but because one side had won. The Sinaloa cartel had secured control of most of the routes, relegating the Juárez cartel to a shadow of its former self. Vicente Carrillo Fuentes, El Viceroy, became a fugitive and was finally arrested in 2014. The legacy of the war is a city left deeply traumatized, with scars that will take generations to heal. The peace that returned to Juárez is fragile, an absence of war rather than true tranquility. The drug trade didn't disappear, it simply changed hands. The brutality of those years left a grim lesson. The quiet corporate empire of Amado Carrillo Fuentes, built on corruption and logistics, was a monster in a cage. His death didn't destroy the monster, it just broke the cage. The true inheritance of the Lord of the Skies was not his fortune or his fleet of planes, but the hell his fall unleashed upon the city that gave him his power. The story of the Juárez cartel is a chronicle of transformation, a study of how organized crime in Mexico evolved from clans of smugglers to multinational corporations and, finally, to warring paramilitary armies. At the center of this evolution stands the enigmatic figure of Amado Carrillo Fuentes, a man whose legacy is as complex and contradictory as the country that produced him. His rise represented a new archetype of capo, the criminal CEO. Unlike his predecessors and contemporaries, who often reveled in violence and ostentation, Amado understood that true power lay in invisibility and efficiency. His genius was not that of a warrior, but of a chief operating officer. He revolutionized drug trafficking by applying principles of logistics and supply chain management to an illicit industry, multiplying its scale and profitability in ways no one had imagined. One could argue, from a purely criminal perspective, that he was an innovator, a visionary who built an empire that transcended borders and bought governments. During his reign, he imposed a pax mafiosa on Juárez. Violence, while ever present, was a controlled instrument, a tool of business rather than a campaign of terror. The city, flooded with narco dollars, experienced a superficial economic boom. Amado was the de facto power, the shadow government that maintained order, albeit an order based on fear and illegality. However, this view ignores the fundamental nature of his empire. The peace he maintained was the peace of a tyrant. His system was based on a corruption so corrosive that it dissolved trust in public institutions. He created a de facto narco-state in northern Mexico, where the law was not that of the Constitution, but of plata o plomo, silver or lead. The prosperity he brought to a few was financed by the addiction and death of countless others. His most devastating legacy was not what he built, but the vacuum he left behind. The centralized empire he created was unsustainable without his unique leadership. His death was like the breaking of a dam holding back an ocean of violence. The war that followed for control of his plaza was not an unforeseen consequence, but the inevitable result of a system built on ambition and betrayal. The brutality that consumed Juárez, with its thousands dead, its families shattered, and its social fabric torn to shreds, is the true inheritance of the Lord of the Skies. He didn't pull the trigger in the Villas de Salvarcar massacre or detonate the car bomb, but he created the conditions that made such horrors possible. The machinery of death that his successors and rivals perfected was built on the foundation he laid. So, who was Amado Carrillo Fuentes, really? Was he the brilliant strategist who took drug trafficking to its corporate peak? A ghost who ruled an empire from the shadows? Or was he simply the architect of a disaster foretold? A man whose ambition created a monster that, once masterless, devoured the city that had fed it? The answer, perhaps, is that he was both. He was the product and the perfecter of a system where the lines between law and crime, the state and the cartel, had become indistinguishable. His story is a grim reminder that empires built on violence and corruption, no matter how sophisticated they seem, are destined to collapse. And they often drag everyone living in their shadow down to hell with them. The answer lies buried under thousands of bodies in the Chihuahuan desert. Behind every fortune, there's a story no one dares to tell. And we will keep digging up the truth, no matter how deep the grave. You already know where to find it. Subscribe for more.